Hey everyone, welcome to the first issue of Adaptations Anatomy. I'm Nick Palazzo, and I'm not a professional screenwriter, but I do play one on the internet. Check out the links below for more info on that. This video, and indeed this channel, is not in fact meant to be a lot of commentary on whether or not the material we cover is quote-unquote good. Nor are we going to be measuring its adherence to the lore of the original in any rigorous degree. There are plenty of channels better equipped to do, or with greater interest in both of those matters. It's not to say we won't have commentary on either. I don't think I have enough restraint to avoid that, but that isn't the point of what I'm going to be doing here. I'm also not an expert in pronunciation of Tolkien's language, so don't at me. I'm doing my best out here. In this issue, we're covering the season premiere of Amazon Prime's Lord of the Rings, Rings of Power, A Shadow of the Past. A little bit of a mouthful there. We're going to be going scene by scene, talking about the pacing and structure of the episode. We're also going to discuss the setups and payoffs and how the scenes of the episode connect to each other. So without further ado, let's get started. First, Galadriel's voiceover describes life in Valinor. Child Galadriel makes an origami unfolding boat. It's destroyed by another elvish child, and she jumps him until Finrod shows up. Finrod drops some wisdom on her, some of which we don't hear, and we get a glimpse of the two trees of Valinor. Basic introductory scene shows some of the ethereal qualities of the elves and the magical land where Galadriel comes from. Also shows that the elves are far from perfect beings. I was a little surprised at how much older than Galadriel Finrod is shown to be, though I guess I shouldn't have been, because elves. Makes sense given his placement here as a mentor figure, but it still felt a little jarring to see a grown man talking to a child that isn't his. Either way, I was excited to see the two trees rendered on screen. Looked great. In the next sequence, Galadriel's voiceover describes the destruction of the trees and the War of the Jewels without referencing the jewels themselves. Sauron is introduced, as is Finrod's oath to hunt him down. Also, Galadriel's acceptance of this oath upon her brother's death. A little strangeness here lore-wise. Firstly, the battle shown seems to be an amalgamation of several battles fought during the First Age. The last major engagement in which Finrod participates in the published Silmarillion is the Dagor Bragollach, or Battle of Sun and Flame. But there was only one dragon in that battle, and he couldn't fly. Also, no eagles involved. Well, one, but that's complicated. Anyway, there seem to be including elements from the War of Wrath here as well, and the pile of helmets afterwards is likely a homage to the Howth and Nirnaeth, or Hill of Tears after the Nirnaeth Arnoediad. This is a common product of adaptation and gets a bunch of First Age plot elements on the screen. Since they're not going to tell the whole story of the First Age, that makes some sense. What was a bit more difficult to get past was the change to Finrod's motivation. In the First Age, Finrod dies saving Beren, who's the ancestor of Elrond and later Aragorn, supporting Beren's quest for the Silmaril, and ultimately to win the hand of his lady love, Luthien. Now again, they are decidedly not telling that story here, so it's not surprising that they simplified it down to a revenge story. And I'm more than a little mad that they thought about Vengeant Galadriel before I did, but that's a story for another channel. Then we get the ice climber scene. We slip out a voiceover signaling that we now have caught up with the present day in the show. We can tell a few things from cool little details in this scene. Firstly, the tattered state of the clothing and armor of the elves suggests that they've been at this for a little while. We've been conditioned to see elves as perpetually pristine. That's not so here. While the rest of the team of warriors stops to help the last of them onto a ledge, it becomes clear that Galadriel herself has continued alone. This shows us immediately that there is tension between her and the rest of the group, and possibly tension that she herself has created. This is supported when Galadriel has a confrontation with one of her subordinates over the state of their hunt for Sauron. He tells us that Galadriel alone of the elvish commanders seems to think that their quarry even persists in the world. He suggests that they rest and then return to part south. Galadriel ignores this suggestion with a current order to continue the march. After nightfall, one of Galadriel's soldiers falls, and another calls for her to stop. At first, she ignores his cries until he calls her by name rather than by rank. When she turns to see what's actually happened, she is finally moved to compassion and gives the fallen soldier her own cloak. This tells us that while Galadriel might be blinded by her monomaniacal hunt for Sauron, she is not without care for those under her command. To a point. At last, lightning reveals that they have indeed arrived at their destination. I'm convinced that this is meant to be Morgoth's first fortress of Autumno, but I digress. At the ruined fortress at Tumno, Galadriel finds evidence of Sauron's presence long ago. This evidence is the presence of the same rune she found on Finrod's body. Remember this one, because that's going to be important later as well. Once again, her subordinate is resistant to continuing the hunt and even tells us that Galadriel has exceeded her king's orders. She's unmoved by this and tells us that she misses the trees, which more on that later, but she can't return home until this evil has been eradicated. Next, the troll appears, who is more than a match for the company until Galadriel arrives and kills it solo. I'm not a huge fan of the choreography here, but I'll leave that for other channels to break down. Now, I already hear the comments about this girl boss moment, and you could be right. But remember that bit where she talks about the trees to her subordinate? There's a suggestion here that he has not seen them himself, which would exclude him from the Calaquendi subgroup of which Galadriel is a part, and might even exclude him from the Noldor, also called the High Elves, entirely. This would indeed put Galadriel at a significantly higher power level than the rest of them, so maybe. I can't rule out the girl boss thing, but this is Galadriel. If anyone's going to get away with being a girl boss, it's her. Anyway, after she defeats the trolls, she says,
"We march at first light."
Her subordinates, however, have other ideas and lay their weapons down in what appears to be a ceremonial way, indicating that they're not going to be continuing. This also calls back to the earlier scene where the Noldor were swearing to seek out Morgoth, but in reverse. Okay, that's it. That's the episode. Okay, alright, there's more, but let's talk about this real quick. This is the introduction to a new show, so there's always going to be some pacing weirdness, especially at the beginning of the episode. And at about 15 minutes in, we've already had a story with a beginning, middle, and end. So if you felt strangely on edge through the next few scenes, that might be why. They've already raised your tension level quite high at this point, and then with just a moment's respite in the title card, retreated to cheeky Harfoot antics. This certainly isn't the only show to ever do this in a series premiere, and I don't think it was done particularly poorly here. But it's a thing that's happening, and we should be willing to admit that. So let's get to those Harfoots. Hunters passing through miss the presence of the Harfoots, particularly one played by Kieran Shah. Yep, I recognize you under that makeup. Thanks for joining us. Sadok, the local magi or astronomer guy, seems disturbed by this omen, but publicly passes it off as a chance encounter. We also meet Largo and Marigold Brandyfoot, the parents of the character we will spend a lot more time with. We all know what the Harfoots are doing here, so let's move on. The nostalgia they bring works pretty well, in my opinion, and watching the Harfoot village come alive is absolutely adorable. I imagine that this is the ordinary magic that Tolkien describes the hobbits as having. I'm going to have to take a closer look at my backyard. Anyway, the important thing we get out of the conversation between Mari and Largo. That's odd and unfortunate. Anyway, Nori is different. Her mother is actively worried about their other children, specifically because she is with them, likely getting them into trouble. Which indeed she is. In an adventure reminiscent of Beatrice Potter, they've gone berry picking. Nori and Poppy are introduced as they and some other children steal berries from an old farm near their encampment. They come across evidence of a large predator they think is a wolf. We actually see it, and it doesn't look like one, but it does look like something else. Sadok's Big Book of Omens has predicted their presence following that of the hunters, who themselves have complained about wolves. Let's hope Sadok does not regret ignoring the warnings of the book. Meanwhile, in Lindon, Elrond's introduced. He's writing a speech for something later and is interrupted by an initially unwanted visitor. She informs him that he has been disinvited from a future council meeting. Elf Lords only. This seems like a strange detail to me, unless it is to more firmly land Elrond's rank in the minds of the viewer familiar with The Lord of the Rings. It could also be because Elrond is half-elven, although nobody says anything about that at some point. But this is not the Elf Lord of Imladris. Elrond is the herald to the High King, Gil-galad. Could this have been communicated more effectively? Probably. I'm not sure why this messenger has been sent just to put Elrond in his place, and we never see this council meeting. It seems a setup that gets abandoned. Although it's not lost on me that Elrond's king, Gil-galad, is summoned to a secret council, and he is not. Now, the episode seems to have something of a 4-act structure, and we seem to have come to the end of the first act, the completed arc of the intro notwithstanding. First act in a 4-act structure typically sets up the story. And the second gives us our rising action as the problem that the protagonist is happening becomes more apparent. The third act is usually called a crisis point, where the situation is going to be more difficult for the protagonist to overcome than they thought. The fourth act is typically your resolution, your climax, denouement. That's where we get our catharsis. Now, the first act of the first episode has a lot of heavy lifting to do, and this one is chock full, taking up almost half of the episode. So it's not surprising that, well, we'll get to that in a minute. While I'm here, though, I want to thank you for checking us out. Please do like and share the video if you like it or want to share it. This is a new endeavor, and with your help, we can make it worth it to cover the series all the way through to the end, and maybe get a chance to do some stuff other than Rings of Power. Nori returns in what seems to be the beginning of the second act as she speaks with her father and mother about what she's been up to, again mentioning wolves. Her conversation with her mother reveals her desire to learn about the world beyond the life of the Harfoots. We are then introduced to what that life is by her mother's rebuke. Nori leaves her with one of the berries that she's brought home, and while Marigold allows herself a little bit of a smile, we can definitely see her concern for her daughter. Back in Linden, we get the Warrior's Reward. We are introduced to Gil-galad here. Now, I know that most of our characters have already been introduced, but he doesn't have a story of his own here. He exists in this episode solely as a supporting character for Galadriel and for Elrond. Gil-galad is giving a speech, the one written by Elrond in the earlier scene. In fact, in a blink-and-you'll-miss-it moment, we saw Elrond handing off the speech to an attendant for that express purpose. It's clear that Elrond is Hamilton to Gil-galad's Washington. Elrond is even mouthing the words of the speech as they are spoken. Galadriel's reaction to this is a bit vague. She's definitely amused, but I'm not sure if it's at Elrond's expense or not. She might be happy to see how much influence the younger elf has attained for someone not an elf lord, or she might be silently laughing at him for being a politician, as she said earlier. Anyway, Gil-galad crowns each of these heroes with a laurel of golden leaves and announces that they are going home to Valinor. That this comes as a complete surprise to Galadriel suggests Gil-galad as a pretty authoritarian king. Not only did he not discuss Galadriel's own fate with her, but he seems extremely confident that she will accept the orders without making a public scene. I'm not sure that this will be a trait Gil-galad will carry with him through the show, but it's not a pleasant one. And that's fine for now. We've got a long way to go with this character, and that he has some room for growth isn't an issue. Now, there are some lore questions here about why, if these elves see a return to Valinor as a positive, they're not all going. Second Age elves in Linden are refugees from the ruin of Beleriand at the end of the First Age, and were given the opportunity to return to Valinor then, at least the island of Tol Eressëa at its doorstep. They didn't go, so they must want to be here for some reason. Based upon the prologue piece, that was a long time ago, but still, it's a little weird to me. But I'll let folks better acquainted with the material than I hash that one out. The celebration continues with some fireworks. Would elves have fireworks? I don't know if elves would have fireworks, but if they did, they would definitely look like this. In some sort of memorial garden, Galadriel is standing before the wood-carved sculpture of her brother Finrod. There are others here, most of whom are not that easy to identify, but one of the figures is surely Luthien, and another I think is Fingon the Valiant. He's holding the dragon helm. He's Gil-galad's father in some versions of the tale, including the one that the actor who plays Gil-galad in this series has decided to accept for himself. It's clear that Galadriel expected to die here in Middle-earth. Perhaps that means that she considers her obsession a suicidal quest. So when Elrond bluntly says that she will lead elves to die, there's some teeth to that accusation. In the beginning of this scene, Galadriel has no intention of going to Valinor, as ordered by Gil-galad, but by the end of it, Elrond seems to have convinced her that it is the best course. At least, he's the last one to speak, which in the language of cinema means that he wins. Still, Galadriel seems from her intense expression that there's still some room for doubt there. Then, welcome to the introduction of the Southlands plotline. But I hear you saying, isn't that something we should be doing in the first act of the episode? And yes, that would typically be the case. Now, Gil-galad was introduced late in the episode, but as I said then, he doesn't have a story of his own. Arondir and Bronwyn do have a story of their own, so introducing them after the 36-minute mark seems strange at best. I can understand to a degree given how late in the episode we made our transition into rising action, which the preceding 3 scenes certainly seem to be. But still, we have to rush from one scene in this plotline to another to catch up with the rest of the episode. So if the pacing at this point feels a bit choppy and weird, that's why. The introduction comes from Arondir's perspective as he enters the human settlement. The place feels slovenly in comparison to the well-kept home of the elves, with none of the colorful, cheery charm of that of the Harfoots. This is the land of men, which means there are pigs and mud and plenty of unwashed, wart-covered humans. It isn't atypical to present medievalish humanity as filthy and gray and dull, so I don't have a very strong objection here, at least not towards Rings of Power specifically. but I still don't like it when filmmakers fall into this trap. Arendir walks into some sort of bar, butcher, shop place. That there is butchery going on seems intended to further illustrate the comparative barbarism of these humans versus the elves, but again, your mileage may vary. Some antagonism is revealed between the elves and the men in this area. The ancestors of these humans apparently fought on the side of Morgoth during the First Age, and the elves have remained as occupiers ever since. Now, the occupation seems more or less benevolent. No visible oppression exists, but the elves seem to have taken up residence in the local fortification, and likely would not take it too kindly if the humans began arming themselves for their own defense. Anyway, this antagonism is at first displayed more subtly when the bartender butcher tries to gloss over the possibility of someone's cattle being deliberately poisoned, then more clearly when a young man confronts the nosy elf. He even says something about their rightful king returning. It's not super clear what he means, whether he means some historical figure, or if he means Sauron or even Morgoth here. No violence ensues here. In fact, the bar butcher tries to punch the young hothead for knocking a cup from his hand, and Arendir catches the punch in the air. This seems intended to set a more pacifistic stance on Arendir's part. He's probably not in any way opposed to violence against orcs or other enemies, but despite this young kid's attitude, he's not Arendir's enemy per se, and he doesn't want to see him get hurt. Now, we do see Bronwyn here. She's very clearly important, and Arendir clearly thinks so as well, as he watches her leave, and shortly after does so himself. Outside, the two of them share a scene of their own at the well. They clearly have an established relationship, and she's obtained some rare flower seeds for him from a fellow healer, which are probably at least related to the Silmarillion that we see on the graves of the kings of Rohan back in Lord of the Rings. They speak briefly about healers amongst the elves, a discussion that seems a bit strange to me, but I do know that Tolkien discusses elvish healing quite a bit in works I have not yet read, so maybe there's something there. Anyway, there's clearly something they both consider illicit about their relationship, because when the butch tender comes outside, they both pretend they weren't just having a moment together, and Arendir rushes off. Now, normally having a relationship revealed in this way isn't a bad thing. In fact, calling it a relationship in the sense that we typically mean it today is somewhat misleading. They're a bit flirty, but there's no kissing, no pet names, no confessions of love. They're at best in the beginning stage of a relationship. They're talking, as they say. But relationships between elves and humans, especially between a male elf and a female human, are exceedingly rare. It's a big deal, and to have this one develop off-screen and to be presented to us as a matter of fact is a strange choice. I get it, she's been here this whole time, so there's no opportunity for a meet-cute, and we need to get to the action. But it's not the story's fault, independent of the storytellers. They could have done anything they wanted here, and they chose to do this. Anyway, Arendir goes off with his partner, who clearly doesn't approve, which seems appropriate, and Arendir gets off a weird barb about him smelling like rotten leaves. I don't know why that's there, other than to get a dig in on this character the audience is meeting for the first and possibly the last time after the scene that comes right after this. Not sure it was necessary to knock this guy down, except maybe to make Arendir feel more like the cool one. They make it back to the tower where they are stationed to find that they are actually being recalled. Gil-galad seems pretty serious about the nothing is wrong attitude, and he's having all the remote outposts close up shop. Arendir has a brief conversation with his immediate superior, who has some choice things to say about the people whose lands they've been occupying. He seems aware of Arendir's affairs in the village because he makes it very clear that it is to Arendir's benefit that they are leaving the people of Tir Harad behind them. Not entirely convinced, Arendir returns to the village to meet with Bronwyn again, whose son Theo, introduced for the first time, yep, we'll talk about that in a minute, seems less than thrilled to see him. Arendir seems intensely uncomfortable talking to Bronwyn, and she seems at the end of her patience with him. Their flirtation has likely gone on for some time without them making it overt. Theo interrupts them, however, because one of the people from the meat bar has brought a sick cow for her to look at. When asked what's wrong with the cow by Arendir, he doesn't answer. We're told what her symptoms aren't. She's not feverish, and she has no sores. Oh, she does give crude oil instead of milk now, so that's weird, but her owner is surprised by this, so it's not really clear why he decided she was sick. Now, I can think of reasons, I just wish they didn't make me do that to make the scene make sense. Turns out that the cow was grazing somewhere as far east as the nearby village, Hordern. For those new to Tolkien, east is often code for bad. Arondir sets off immediately to investigate, and Bronwyn with him. Left alone, Theo gets his own scene and runs off with a friend named Rohan to what appears to be someone else's barn, where Theo has either found or stashed the hilt of a broken sword. I think the aggression suggested on the part of the barn's owner by Rohan, along with Theo's description of finding a loose board, are intended to tell us that Theo found the sword there. That might be more clear to some, but it wasn't to me on first viewing. Now, maybe the owner of the barn might become part of the story later, but if not, I'm not sure why we needed that layer of confusion. Rowan chides Theo about his mother's potential relationship with Arondir, which immediately angers Theo. Also, there's some mention of Theo's father here. It's not clear exactly what happened, but it's clear that he's no longer in the picture. Theo's already become pretty possessive of the sword because he freaks out when Rowan touches it, and Rowan flees due to a noise from outside. Theo becomes attracted to a rune on the blade, the same rune that Galadriel was obsessing over earlier. A gust of wind blows Theo's hair back, and the rune bursts into flames as the music ominously swells. Now, I promised to talk about Theo's introduction. This is something of a borderline scenario because he clearly has a storyline of his own. He's resistant to the presence of Arondir at the house, as well as even the suggestion that his mother might have romantic feelings for an elf. Teenage boy might have a similar reaction even under the best of circumstances, though, so I'm not sure how much that's supposed to mean there. And then he has this scene which is clearly from his point of view. So to introduce a character who has anything other than a supporting role 3/4 of the way through an episode is strange. Again, a product of starting the Southlands plot very late in the episode. Gil-galad, on the other hand, continues his supporting role with Elrond, who is looking wistfully out to sea after the departure of Galadriel. He says that she's left his sight, but this is Elrond we're talking about, so that could be thousands of miles away. He speaks of the difficulties of friendship and duty mingled, which Gil-galad assures him is an issue often faced by those who wish to be leaders, which implies that Elrond does indeed want that. This ties back to the scene where Elrond was introduced, where he was reminded about his not being an elf lord. Here, we're introduced to Celebrimbor, first by reputation and then in person. Again, this is not unusual, as Celebrimbor has no role in this episode other than to appear. This is essentially the closure of Elrond's plot arc in this episode, such as it is. It's resolved in that, to his knowledge, Galadriel is safely on her way back to Valinor. Oh, remember the Harfoots? We haven't seen them in over 20 minutes due to the placement of the Southland story, but here we are visiting them with them again. The scene starts with Sadok studying his book and comparing it with the stars. Something is said about their eyes being open when they shouldn't be. Not sure what that's supposed to mean exactly, because the sky seems pretty normal in the shot where we see it. Point of view switches to Nori, though, when she appears to surprise Sadok. She has questions about his mutterings, which he does not answer to her satisfaction before she's called away. Despite the Elrond story pretty much ending in the previous scene, this one has not yet come to a conclusion. In the Southlands, Bronwyn and Arondir are approaching Hordern. As the end of their day-long journey approaches, Arondir asks Bronwyn about her connections with the town, which he says was once especially close in its ties to Morgoth. Could he have had this conversation with her earlier in the trip? Probably, but that wasn't a scene we were going to see, so he asks her here. Is that realistic? Probably not. But it's a common thing in films and TV for conversations to take place when the scene would be made more dramatic by some other factor, like them seeing smoke rising from Hordern over the hill. Why they couldn't see that before they had their conversation, I have no idea. But the audience doesn't see it, so it doesn't count. This ends their story for this episode. Galadriel, meanwhile, is undergoing some sort of ceremony along with her soldiers, where their armor is removed, probably in preparation for their peaceful life in Valinor. What happens is the ship makes the journey is somewhat vague, likely to be able to appeal to the several versions of the story regarding the nature of Valinor and even Arda itself. So if it seems like you're not clear on how this works, that's probably a deliberate choice. While Galadriel is strongly encouraged to straighten up and fly right along with the others, she remembers her conversation with Finrod from the beginning of the episode, and we hear the piece of advice that we missed last time. Sometimes we must touch the darkness to know from which direction comes the true light. As a piece of philosophic wisdom, that's not terrible, as long as it isn't carried too far, I guess. Armed with this chestnut, Galadriel scoops up her brother's dagger and dives into the sea where the ship disappears. She's left alone in the dark. Oh, meteor. Almost forgot. While this is happening, we see a meteor streaking out from west to east. Passes the ship, Gil-galad, Elrond, and Celebrimbor, whose islands are probably going in the wrong direction. Past Arendir and Bronwyn, past a family of Ents, and in Enting, by the way, and finally landing near Nori's village around the same time that Galadriel makes her leap. This seems to tie all of the characters together as part of the same world, and at the same time. Why not, if you're going to have a celestial event? Leaving Galadriel alone in the ocean, we'll get to that next time, we briefly return to Gil-galad in time for one of the leaves of the large tree beside his seat of power to fall at his feet. When he picks it up, there's some sort of dark light spreads across it and seems to suck smoke into it from somewhere. Not sure exactly what's happening there, but perhaps we'll return to Lindon in a later episode. As it is, this is not a story of Gil-galad's own, but a teaser of things to come. This sort of thing is typically referred to as a tag at the end of an episode, but more importantly, Nori has found her way to the site of the meteor crash for the conclusion of her story. Alone of the Harfoots, she is different enough, as we have been told by her mother, her friend Poppy, and Sadok to have done this. There, in the center of the small, oddly eye-shaped crater, she finds a disheveled, mostly naked man. Who he is left a mystery for now, even through the second episode. And I have zero interest in getting into that on the mic. Mostly the episode appears to work, given the massive amount of heavy lifting it has to do. It's running 4 main plots, along with 7 point-of-view characters, 8 if you count that tiny bit where Gil-galad is alone. It's a lot to do, but it does seem choppy and stilted in places as the writers do their best to keep all the pieces running correctly. I'm certainly interested in seeing more, and bringing you folks more analysis next time here on Adaptations Anatomy.